Hello, everyone. It's always an education for me to listen to the lead-in music, especially if I haven't suggested it. There was I 5 minutes ago saying, are we going to have marching bands? Well, no, we have moved on, and maybe the monarchy has too. Thank you all very much for joining us. My name's Giles Whittell. I'm an editor at Tortoise, and this is our regular Friday lunchtime Sensemaker Live Think In, which we do in partnership with Santander. We are grateful to them for their support. Sometimes I feel that what with the three C's, COVID and climate change, if you're following all the news all the time, it can become oppressive and you feel there's no time to stand back and think the big thoughts, ask the big questions about how we live. But of course, we have to do that as well. You have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time, as Barack Obama used to say. And that's especially important if you're a tortoise, because if you're a tortoise and you stop for anything, you never get anywhere. Anyway, yesterday, the news bulletins didn't clear their schedules, but they gave space to the poignant sight of Princes Harry and William unveiling a statue to their mother on what would have been her 60th birthday. Last month, David McClure, one of our guests today, wrote a very interesting and substantial piece for us about the royal finances, focusing on royal security and its cost. In April, the Duke of Edinburgh died. And amongst all the coverage, there was, I think it's perfectly reasonable and tasteful to say, a sense of an era drawing to a close. Of course, the Queen is still with us, but she's not getting any younger. And her son, Charles, has said that when he becomes king, one of his priorities is going to be to slim down the size of the royal operation. I don't know if slim down is more than a journalistic shorthand, but I think we can use it today. So that the point of today's discussion is to try and get a sense of what we as the public think is an appropriate amount of slimming to do. What's the right amount of slim? We've got some really tremendously informed special guests, including David, who I've just mentioned, and others who I think I'll introduce as we get to you. So hang tight on that. First, housekeeping. I suspect most of you have been to a Think In before, but just in case any of you haven't, we want to hear from you. So activate your black bars along the bottom. Let's hear from you in the chat. My colleague Phoebe is there and will be helping me keep an eye on who's saying what, and we'll be bringing people in. And do please, let's use the electronic hand. You really get our attention that way. Now, even though, as I was saying to our speakers just before we started, our framing question is, actually, I forget the exact wording. It's what's the right amount of slimming for the royal family. I'm quite relaxed about any other aspect of the royals that any of you want to talk to. Angela Levin, one of our guests, is among other things the biographer of Prince Harry. We want to go there? Let's go there. But first of all, let me come to David. Thank you for joining us. As I understand it, from a hotel room in Brighton.
That's correct. Having a short break.
Good for you.
Excuse the girls in the background if they're too noisy.
Oh no, it's very good of you to take time out of a holiday for that. David, you're the author, in addition to the great piece of reporting for us, which I recommend to everybody. There's a lot of shoe leather, literal shoe leather, creeping through undergrowth there, which makes it very dramatic, but author also of The Queen's True Worth, a book on the Queen's true worth. Now, your piece focused on security, but let's just get to the title of your book for a second. You ended up with an estimate of around £150 million a year for security for the family, but how does that stack up against the Queen's true worth?
Well, you should look at two things. First of all, the cost of the monarchy. The formal cost of the monarchy, as we heard last week from the sovereign grant, is about, they said it's about £1.29 per every person in the country. And that's because the cost of the sovereign grant is about £83 million, £85 million a year. But the overall cost of the monarchy is much higher than that because those figures don't include security and various other hidden costs. And security is the biggest sort of elephant in the room, hidden cost that isn't talked about. And that's, as we revealed in the piece last week, is around about £150 million a year, which is a lot of money. And one of the ways you can have a slimmed down monarchy, and the aim of the slimmed down monarchy is to save money, is to have fewer royals and to have less money spent on their security, which is enormous. So one thing which might be helpful at the beginning is just to define terms. What is a working royal? How many of them are we slimming down? A working royal is really a royal who receives public money, either money from the sovereign grant to pay for their office and their travel, or money from the taxpayer to pay for their security. And at the moment, there are probably about 10 to 12 working royals. That's the Queen, Charles and Camilla, William and Kate, Edward and Sophie, the three Kent siblings. So that gets to about 11. So people who aren't working royals are people like Beatrice and Eugenie, who are close to the royal family, who appear at Ascot and all of that, but don't do formal duties and as such don't get public money.
So it's defined by the provenance of the money they receive rather than any of the duties they perform.
Well, the two things are linked. They don't do duties unless they get money. You know,
right.
they don't do any formal duties. They don't represent the Queen unless they're in receipt of the sovereign grant and are formally accepted as a working royal. So Eugenie and Beatrice don't do formal engagements.
Right. Is there a formal audit of the engagements that the working royals do? I know that if you look at the royal accounts, in addition to money spent, they give a total of engagements performed by the senior royals. But are those figures also available, for example, for the Kents?
Yes, if they're doing a formal engagement, they will come up there, but they don't do so many. You know, I have to remember they're getting old. You know, the Duke of Kent, I think, is 86. His brother is late 70s. So, you know, as they get older, they're doing less formal engagements. But, you know, it is formally recorded. It's recorded in the court circular. It's recorded in the list of the sovereign grant. But sometimes those figures are slightly misleading because you can sometimes do several engagements in one day. And if you're doing a foreign tour, sometimes you do 6. So sometimes when you say he or she is the hardest working royal, slightly misleading because you should factor in the amount of time that's happened during it and the number of engagements. So sometimes the figures are slightly misleading.
Okay, thank you. David, we saw in the slides that it's been reported that the number of working royals that Charles favours is about 8. Is that your understanding, and do you think it's an appropriate number?
No, I think it's a bit lower than that. I think it's 6. We got a clue of that at the Queen's Jubilee, the Diamond Jubilee 9 years ago, where there are 6 working royals on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, and excluded were Eugenie and Beatrice, much to the annoyance of the Duke of York. So I think the aim, as much as we can guess, the aim of Charles is to have 6 working royals. And this has been going on a long time. He first floated this balloon in 1990 on his 40th birthday. So he's been informally pushing this plan for, you know, getting on for 30 years. And the reason probably why it hasn't happened, obviously, is the longevity of the Queen. So I think his aim is to have something like 6 working royals, which basically corresponds to many European royal families. On average, they have about 6, although Spain managed to do things with 2, and at the moment I think Sweden has 4.
Fascinating. There's a question that I actually want to put to all of you. I'm going to move on now, but David, I'll come back to you, I'm sure, more than once in the hour. Angela Levin, as I mentioned, you are Harry's biographer. You've spent probably more than a year with him. I'd really like to know what "with" means. But you've also written extended profiles of Charles and Camilla. Just before we get into sort of your expertise. What do you make of, just picking up on David's point, what do you make of the fact that we're left to guess about something like this? That there's the Kremlinology of looking at the royal family on a balcony years ago. We're a parliamentary democracy. Can't we know what the plan is for the organization that supplies us with the head of state?
Well, one reason you can't is that Prince Charles has loads of plans for changing the monarchy and making it more realistic in today's world. But he doesn't want to upset the Queen. She's used to things going on for decades. And he feels that if he starts talking about it, in a way, it means he's wanting her to die, which he does not, to put it in very simple words.
Right.
And he's kept a lot of this back because she's happy with things as they are. They've been the same for a very long time. She does move forward. I mean, she changed the laws so that if William and Catherine's child was a girl first, that she would take over the throne. But on the whole, she likes to, she's still got a sort of electric heater that goes right back to 1940, I think. So he's just being very careful. So these things are officially leaked in a small way so that people get some sort of idea what will happen in the future, but that the main thing is not to disturb or upset the Queen. She is the monarch and she will remain in charge. He's very respectful. And that's why we don't get to know all sorts of other details. I think there may be a flood of them once she passes, but not before. And I think that's appropriate, actually. I think nothing could be worse, however old she is, if people start saying, well, I'm going to get rid of this and I'm going to stop that as soon as I'm king. I think it's very distasteful.
All right, well, that's a persuasive answer that rests on the nature of the family and his relationship with his mum. Fair enough. I'd just like to do a quick detour before we come back to, I'd like to ask you in a second about how much slimming down you think that the family needs to do, if any. But tell us a little bit about your contact with Harry to write your book. How much FaceTime?
Well, I was with him for about 15 months. And this...
with means actually shadowing him?
Yeah, well, hang on. This includes going with him to a whole load of royal engagements. I could choose whichever ones I wanted to go to, and I went with him to that. It took me just under a year to persuade him to see me on my own in Kensington Palace, where we had a one-to-one conversation. And then once I'd sort of broken the ice there, I saw him several times after that. But if you are a journalist or a writer, you have an instinct for body language. And if you're there somewhere, you don't necessarily have to talk so much, you have to watch. I watched him how he was with different age people in all sorts of different situations. And he was brilliant with children. He was absolutely brilliant with people who were damaged, particularly ex-soldiers, men and women. And several of them, when he moved on to talk to someone else, they would say to me, you know, in 5 minutes, he's given me a reason to live. So he had this incredible talent to go deep without offending, and very similar to his mother. And so I worked my way into what he was doing, and a lot of it was very personal. In fact, I was the person he first said to it was a disgrace that he was walking behind his mother's coffin. That went worldwide. But you can't get that sort of thing when you're there for 5 minutes. You have to be incredibly patient. And I was. So, you know, that's the way I prefer to do things. You can't go in and ask 40 questions and want snap answers.
No. And was it pure patience that got you the sit down, or did you have a killer question that
I had a killer question. I'm pleased you asked me that, because I was told after struggling so many months that I could go and see him in Kensington Palace. But they said to me, you've only got 20 minutes. So my heart sank, because you can't ask anybody anything in 20 minutes. And I thought, I'm going to pull out. And I thought, no, go along there, just see. Try and come up with a really good question that will throw him, but makes him understand that you wanted something profound, not a superficial answer. So I thought it hard, and I went there and we sat down, and he said, so I know you've got loads of questions for me. What's your first one? I said, well, my first one is, and we're going back 2.5, 3 years. My first one is, I've seen you with so many damaged people with mental health issues, and you're astonishingly good with them. But I wonder whether at the same time you're using their experiences and how you relate to them to help you with your own mental health issues. So he looked at me, and I thought, I'm going to get thrown out. He's not going to like this. I'm not respectful enough. And he said, that's a very, very big question, you know. So I sat there thinking, I'm either out or I'm in. And then he said, you're right, of course. And from that moment, we then had a sort of discussion as if we'd known each other for a long time. I mean, I didn't tell him about me, but he told me about him. And I think that key question, it wasn't that, what's your favorite engagement, or, you know, how often do you see the Queen? Or any question you might think is a good one. It took me a while to think about it, and I knew that I risked being thrown out. And I thought, well, it's only 20 minutes. There's no point just talking about the weather. I'll get nowhere. So that's how I did it.
Brilliant. And just to be 2 years ago, he'd already gone public a little bit about his mental health, right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
He
So
told
it wasn't as if he was handing you that scoop.
No, but we spent a lot of time talking about his mental health, and he was very open about it, but he hadn't talked to one person about it. He decided what he wanted to say. And it was very moving. I have to say, though, he is a totally different person from the person I liked, who was charismatic and intuitive and energetic, could be a bit grumpy. He liked person-to-person conversations when he was on an engagement. He didn't like sitting there with all the people who are running a charity and hearing about plans and what they need to change and money. He was tap his foot on the floor in impatience. But spending time with someone who was needy and damaged was a speciality. But I don't recognize him now. I don't recognize him now at all.
Interesting. Well, look, I think I need to resist the temptation to go further down that detour, because we won't talk about anything else. However, if I have a full-on rebellion in the chat, Fleur is saying don't resist. Okay, borne in mind. But let's quickly canvass you and then Thomas Mace Archer Mills about the slimming question, and we can come back to Harry and Meghan if people want. What do you think is the appropriate size of the royal family when Charles leads it?
Well, I don't think in appropriate sizes. I'm a huge monarchist, and I think that I would trust Prince Charles to sort it out that would make a lot of sense. I spent a year with him and doing a similar thing, and I felt that people very much misjudged him. I think that it's probably right. It might be 6, it might be 8. That's okay. But they are people who are prepared to give up their time to do what the monarch wants and what the government wants from them, because a lot of the things are on behalf of the government, of course. They're asked to do them. And I think that will cut down the costs, which is very important. And it will also make sure that people don't abuse it. I mean, Prince Andrew abused his role by taking planes here and there and stopping off at the local golf club, or making arrangements to go somewhere on a royal engagement so he could stop off on a golf club. And I think that would be absolutely out. But on the other hand, I think that the people who care about the monarchy and care about the monarch do a terrific job. And I remember when Catherine, William and Harry set up their mental health platform on their foundation, a very, very senior psychiatrist said that he had more people contacted him in the week after they made this statement about their mental health, not being scared to do so, not being ashamed, than he'd had in 20 years. So it might not improve our imports, but it certainly improves people's health.
Thank you, Angela. And before you go, and I know you have to go a little bit early, I'll come back to you because there are questions that I think only you can answer in the chat. But let me come first to Thomas Mace Archer Mills, who is founder and director of the British Monarchist Society, among other things. Same question really for you, Thomas, and thanks very much for joining us. What do you think, how much, if at all, should the family slim down, bearing in mind, and I'm going to throw in a point of context here, that that countries that elect their heads of state generally manage with one?
Yes, well, thank you first and foremost for having us. But this is a very interesting question here because we're looking at it from a very UK-centric point of mind. We need to be mindful that there are the realms out there of which the Queen is head of state, 16 countries in total, plus the head of the Commonwealth, 54 additional nations that look to her for guidance and neutrality. So the slimming of the monarchy is, of course, worrying because if we slim too much, are we able to reach as many people as the monarchy currently does? And of course, Prince Charles has said that the monarchy is there because the people allow it to be, because there's support for it. But if less royals are going out into the communities to actually interact with the people, to show the people that they are being represented, that could be an adverse effect to the slimming of the monarchy. Now, I'm going to agree with Angela that we can trust Prince Charles and what he thinks is best. And of course, the men in the grey suits, not his shade of grey, but the other grey, they will have their input as well. But we have to be careful when we look at slimming the monarchy. Everyone wants money for value these days. Everyone wants to sit there and say, well, the expense for this, the expense for that. But there's a certain brand of magic that the monarchy has that is invaluable. We, as the British Monarchist Society, we campaign for change, positive change. We're not a Queen-loving fan club. We look at the constitutional and parliamentary aspect of the Queen and her heirs in government. And you were right, Giles, when you said we are a parliamentary democracy, but the United Kingdom is also a constitutional monarchy, and that's very important. So even though that elected heads of state or states that elect their premiers, they get one and possibly a lady in waiting or a first gentleman, as we see in several countries, or maybe some of their families. These unilateral one person sort of show is not able to reach as many people as the royal family. Look at the number of engagements. Okay, it was slimmed down this past year due to COVID, but anywhere from 3,900 to over 5,000 engagements per year on a normal average. So we have to take into account, if we slim down the monarchy, not only the United Kingdom, we're slimming down the monarchy as well in 15 additional countries. And that's a very big change to what we have now.
Okay, fair point. In a minute, I want to come to our in-house expert on royal finances, Alexei. But first, Thomas, to the nitty-gritty. I know you have views on the sovereign grant. Tell us what they are.
Well, of course, we all know the sovereign support grant went ahead and replaced the civil list, which was definitely in existence since literally Charles III. I mean, I'm sorry, George III. And when we look at this, the Crown Estate is not owned by the government. It's not owned by the state. It is owned by the Crown. So the Crown is actually taking to operating commercially, a private land portfolio investments. Every sovereign since George III has signed over voluntarily all of those profits. The Queen did it in 1952. She went ahead and said, I'm not going to take this money from the Crown Estate. I'm going to continue to give it to the Treasury. So a lot of people like to say that, oh, well, we need to look at the public money and taxpayer money. So I'm very happy to say that taxpayer money does pay for security. But what we cannot forget, and what a lot of people need to understand and papers need to report, is that the Crown Estate puts in a lot of money, hundreds of millions of pounds into the Treasury, to which the Treasury is actually commingling private funds from the Crown Estate and public funds from tax-raised revenue. So the money going from the Treasury to pay for the Queen as head of state, not a private individual, covering the cost of being the head of state, is actually very interesting, because if we look at the origins and the deposit already made into the Treasury, that money coming out of the Treasury to cover the Queen's costs as Queen is actually already being covered by a private deposit, which is coming from the Crown Estate. Now, the Crown Estate, one second, the Queen doesn't own it. The Crown does. So she is the proprietor, not the owner. But the Crown Estate is led by a board, which does include representatives from the Treasury, the Chancellor, and people within the government.
So just to be clear, Thomas, is it your view that the sovereign should have more control of the sovereign grant and more money from it?
Well, the grant is actually made up of approvals from the government and the Crown Estate. But we are actually we as the society would like to see a change in the sovereign support grant. We would like to see the Treasury not receive the amount that the palace receives. We would like to see the Crown Estate pay the palace, and then everything left over then be donated to the Treasury. It's more accountable. There's less commingling. Well, there wouldn't be commingling of funds from the Crown Estate and the public. And it would actually show that the Crown and the Queen as head of state is being paid directly by the revenues of the Crown Estate, a private entity.
I see what you mean. Okay. Thanks very much. David, I see your hand up there. I see a shake of the head, but I want to come to Alexei first. Alexei, hello.
Hi.
Nice to see you across the park there, if that's where you are.
Absolutely.
Do you recognize Thomas's sort of broad description of how it works? And do you think the kind of change that he advocates would meet with broad public approval or rebellion?
Well, I think David was shaking his head there and putting his hand up in order to object to Thomas's characterization of how the sovereign grant worked. So if I raise some objections myself, then David can correct me if I go wrong. But I think that both David and I agree that to characterize the Crown Estate as a private entity belonging to the Crown and effectively giving the Queen private income is misleading. For hundreds of years, as Thomas said, the Crown has given up the right to the income from the Crown Estate, and actually for good consideration, because before that happened, the Crown Estate was used by the royal family to pay for all sorts of things, including the national defence. So the deal was, we'll give up the income from the Crown Estate, and the government can pay for things like national defence. So it makes a lot of logical sense for us to see the Crown Estate as effectively a public asset. And when George Osborne in 2011 reformed royal finances to say that the Queen and the monarchy was going to receive the equivalent of 15% of the Crown Estate's profits, he was effectively attaching the finances of the monarchy to the Crown Estate for the first time in 250 years. And what we've seen in the since 2011, when those reforms were first mooted, was that the money going from the Crown Estate effectively into the monarchy via the Treasury has increased from about 31 million to about 85 million, simply because the profits from the Crown Estate have increased. This isn't a reflection of the costs of the monarchy going up. This is just a reflection of the funding structure. And it's effectively on a one-way ratchet as well, because even if the profits from the Crown estate go down, the money going into the monarchy can't fall. So lots of people within government were relatively unhappy about this arrangement at the time. We spoke to Sir Andrew Turnbull, who was the former head of the civil service, and he described the whole relationship to us as a lie. Effectively, the allegation of Turnbull was that this was a kind of construct between the palace and George Osborne to remove the thorny issue of royal funding from a kind of regular parliamentary debate and put it into the hands effectively of an entity that sounded like it belonged to the monarchy and may belong to the monarchy legally, but in practice and de facto was a public asset.
Apologies, I muted myself because I had a dog barking downstairs, but he's calmed down now. David, I'm going to keep my promise. We are going to come to you, but I'm also aware that we're about 6 minutes from when Angela has to leave us. So let me quickly come back to you, Angela, to ask you to sort of give you a chance to close things, at least your part of it. You said that you trust Charles to do the right thing. As I mentioned, I'm no expert, but I gather he's a bigger spender than his mum. Do you think, from what you've seen of his character, that he'll follow through on these plans that he's been floating gently ever since he was 40? Or do you think, in fact, the institution sets such store by tradition and gradualism that we'll see much more continuity than change?
I think he is a modernizer, and I think there will be quite a lot of change. You may say he spends more than anybody else, but he makes more than anybody else because of all his various outlets. They are tremendously successful, and the farming and a whole range of things. And he gives very generously to his children as well. I think he's waited a very, very long time. He's been the longest ever heir to the throne who's just been waiting to become a monarch. He could have spent his time on a desert island with lots of cocktails and gorgeous girls, but instead he's been working incredibly hard to try and do things like climate change and plastics, which nobody saw before him. And he is a modernizer, and I think he will do a very good job. I think once the Queen does go, and nobody would wish that on her, really, he will then reevaluate. Of course, I don't think he's going to stick to things, because what he made his mind up, 10, 20, 30 years ago is probably not ideal now. But I think he won't keep looking at it all the time, because that's sort of unkind to his mother, waiting for her to pass.
But do you think that in the fullness of time we'll have a royal family that looks more like another North European royal family with a much lower profile?
I don't think the British monarchy could ever be like any other monarchy. I mean, it's the most popular monarchy in the world. And it's astonishing how many countries have asked me to speak on their television, because they all talk about the monarchy and love the British monarchy. I don't think that happens to any other monarchy. We have a very special monarchy for a whole range of reasons, most of which are obvious. And I think we will always keep that difference. And the number one slot.
It'll always be a good story, and if you're dealing with newsrooms, you may get. I don't know. I'm sure you're right. I'm sure you're right. Let's come to David, and then Thomas. I see your hand. We will come back to you, but I also want to come to whether it's Emma or Tom J, who's on the Emma and Tom J box. You've made an interesting point in the chat. I want to ask you what you mean by that. But David, you've had your hand up.
Yes, I'd just like to come back on what Thomas was saying, and some of it has been answered by Alexei. But basically, when he says that the Crown Estate's money is sort of the Queen's, it's just incorrect. It is indisputably true that the revenue from the Crown Estates is public money. And indeed, the capital is public. And if you want proof of that, you can go to a range of documents I've unearthed from 1989 where the Treasury did a report into this, and they said unequivocally, the revenue from the Crown Estates since 1760 is public money. And indeed, there was a special report done by the Treasury's QC, Mr. Newsom, which also is public money. And indeed, if you go on the website of the Crown Estates, I think there's a question and answer saying, whose is the money? And I think the answer is the money is public money. So I'm quite happy to provide the documentation, stick it on your website from this 1989 review, which unequivocally states that the Crown Estates money is public money. And it's a popular misconception, and it's one that's repeated all the time. And it's repeated all the time because it makes it appear as though the funding of the royal family is painless. And so the Crown Estate, which pays for the sovereign grant, is not our money, it's someone else's, therefore it doesn't cost us anything. That is nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. Crown Estate's money is public money, and the sovereign grant is public money, it's taxpayers' money. And that's just the plain state of affairs.
Okay, thanks for that. Thomas, you did have your hand up. I don't know if you want to come back on that, but I did want to ask, do you sort of accept that in principle, and is your position actually that you want to change that position?
No, we're not changing anything. I didn't say it was the Queen's money. I said it was the Crown's money. There's a very big difference between the Crown and the Queen. And when she acts as the Crown or the Queen or Elizabeth herself, Elizabeth Windsor, let's say. So the Crown Estate is there because of the royal family, because of the kings, and it is signed over. It has been signed over. I'm not disputing what my colleagues said at all. But when we look at the workings and we look as to exactly who owns what, the Crown Estate itself does say that it's not owned by the state at all, and it's governed by a board on behalf of the Crown, on behalf of the sovereign. So this is where it does get hairy, and I'm not saying I'm changing my position at all, but if we didn't have the Crown Estate, we need to look at the amount of money that's generated that is given, surrendered, if you will, to the public good. Hundreds of millions of pounds are given to the Treasury even after Buckingham Palace is paid. That's not the Queen being paid. She doesn't get a paycheck like European counterparts, such as the King of the Netherlands, who actually makes a proper paycheck. If you want to see proper tax-generated revenue paying for a monarch, look at the Netherlands. So this is something that we, I think, take for granted, because in the United Kingdom, it's all about money. That's it. Who does it belong to? Where is it coming from? Well, it comes from the Crown Estate because we have that agreement with the King going back to George III. That's the facts. That's the way it is. So I'm sorry, do you have a question?
No, well, I don't want to get bogged down in semantics. It may be that where we can agree here is that the Crown Estate is a source of Treasury revenue by a long-standing agreement, in exactly the same way as taxpayers are a source of Treasury revenue.
Yes, the government makes money from the Crown. The country makes revenue from the royal family. Brand Finance Journal, who we work with, valued the total amount of the British monarchy, if it was a British company, at over £65 billion to the British taxpayer. So if
that's a Rand Corporation estimate.
Yes, yes. So of course, it depends year over year, what is happening, economics, all of that. But when we look at what we're getting in revenue from the royal family versus the expense, if we were to do away with the Crown Estate and it wasn't to exist at all, the British government and the Treasury would be out over £300 million a year, with the exception of this year due to COVID. That's a big chunk of money that would have to be found to prop up what the Treasury would be losing. And how do we do that? We get revenue by raising taxes. So if we were to take away the royal family, take away the Crown Estate, and the duchies of Cornwall, and also that of Lancaster, which provide a private income for the Queen and her heir, if those were also taken away, they wouldn't revert to the public, they would revert to the people who own them. Those are private landed estates. So there's a lot we can get into, even taxation. The royals do pay tax. So I'm not changing my position at all. There's a lot of schematics here, and necessarily things don't belong to a lot of people, even though we want them to to think otherwise. So,
all right, thank you, Thomas. I said I'd like to come to, forgive me, Emma and Tom is the name of the box. You were making a point about consequence rather than money. If you're still here, it would be great to hear you elaborate. Hello, because I think this goes, if I understood you right, I think this goes back to our original point about the overall cost of the operation and the cost of keeping them safe, and how many we are willing to fund their security for.
Yeah, I just asked, or just raised the idea that if we slim down the monarchy, if something happened to the Sussex children, for example, because of a slimmed down security, what would the public outcry be compared to that of something happening to, let's say, Peter Philip's children, or even those children yet to be born of the Wessexes? And what are we prepared to accept as the consequences of that? How do we, as a public, effectively put our money or not our money where our mouths are?
And what do you think, in these very sort of unique circumstances, what do you think is the sensible answer to that question?
I don't have an answer to that question. I just think it's about thinking it through. I haven't thought it through. I also think that actually it's not just actually the individual response, it's a collective accountability. It's a collective media that says, that's okay. We have called for the slimming down of money. It's following it through, isn't it, to its end. And it's being able to see a strategy through towards its end.
But are you saying in this case that a scenario that we ought to consider is continued funding of security for the Sussexes in California because of the possibility that you mentioned? No,
not necessarily. No, but then I have to be prepared to live with the consequences,
right?
And say that's absolutely fine. If something happens to Archie or Lilibet, I cannot say or complain. I have to accept my own responsibility, accountability, and do it. And nationally, we have to do that too.
Thank you very much. I'd also like to come to Gregory Mulligan, if possible, who I'm afraid we don't have Louis Theroux in this conversation, but you've expressed an interest in the psychological processes at work here. Tell us more about what you mean. Oh, have you got a dog barking? Okay, not to worry. David, if I may, if the dog stops, let's come back to you. I wanted to ask you on a point of, I don't know if it's fact or opinion. Is there such a thing as a working royal who also has a day job? And I don't just mean in this country. Is there an example of that one can point to anywhere?
I don't know enough to talk about European houses on that point. Probably, I don't know. But the example in Britain, I suppose, would be Prince Edward and Sophie, who tried this about 10, 15 years ago. And Sophie, she was a PR executive. She had her own firm. And Edward famously set up a TV company. So he both did, about 10, 15 years ago, he both did his, formal duties, and he ran his TV company and Sophie ran her PR company. And that ended in grief, where there was a sting on Sophie and she said rather uncomplimentary things about the Prime Minister and his wife, and Edward's company, which was going to be a proper TV company making documentaries about everything, only made documentaries on, surprise, surprise, the royal family, and that went bust. So the precedent of trying to mix the two, which in a sense is what Harry was proposing a year and a half ago, to be this hybrid royal of working a bit and doing royal official royal duties. Those two things don't mix. They didn't mix with Edward and Sophie, and I don't think they'd mix with Harry and Meghan, and that's why it's a no-no. The two things don't mix.
Right. So is it your understanding then that the firm's decisions about in relation to Harry and Meghan over the last year and a half have been based more on experience than abstract principle?
I don't know. I'm not close enough to the palace to say that, but I'm sure they looked at what happened in the past. And they also, I suppose, looked at the question of just the potential of getting really tacky, putting it simply, doing a Fergie, maxing out on every commercial activity at the same time as representing the Queen. And that is just fraught with dangers. It was fraught with dangers in the case of Sarah Ferguson, and you had the problems of what happened with Edward and Sophie. So maybe a combination of what happened in the past and a projection of what could happen in the future.
Thanks. Now, while we're talking, Nicola has asked in the chat, what contribution, if any, do the other 15 realms make towards the costs of their heads of state and royal family, or is the UK effectively subsidizing them? Now, this, in a sense, is a point that Thomas started out with, which is that we do hereditary heads of state, not just for ourselves, but for countries all over the world. Do we get anything, David, in financial terms in return?
Well, from other countries. Well, actually, when, say the Queen is head of state of Australia, and when she does a tour of Australia, the tour isn't really paid for by us, by the taxpayer through the sovereign grant. It's actually paid for by the recipient country, the host country, as is the case with most other royal tours. So we get some of their money. And interestingly, in 1952, I discovered some papers where they were looking at the sovereign grant with the new Queen coming in and how they could make more money. The Treasury did raise the issue of maybe other Commonwealth countries like Australia might pay for the royal family. So it's not such an unworldly view, it's not such an incongruous view. It's a possibility. But in practice, we don't get money from them. And taking up Thomas's point, he made a fair point that we're comparing oranges and pears insofar as Sweden and the Netherlands, they just have one country, whilst we have 16 countries to have royals to cater for. So you probably will need more royals in Britain than you would need in Sweden or Netherlands or whatever. So that is a fair point.
David, I'm not going to leave you just yet. We do have time to come back to Thomas, who's got his hand up. I want to come to my colleague Tess as well, because she's put a long post in the chat, and I cannot, speaking of walking and chewing gum at the same time, talk and read at the same time. So I'd love you to say what's on your mind, Tess. But David, out of curiosity, what got you into this line of reporting? What got you clambering out of your car at dawn outside royal residences all over the country?
Totally by mistake. I really wasn't, 15 years ago, I wasn't interested in the royal family whatsoever. By background, I'm a current affairs political journalist. That's my main area. Actually, it got family death, basically. I got into looking at it being an executor. I proposed an idea to Channel 4 about contested estates. One of the contested estates happened to be Princess Margaret's, and they wanted more information about that, and I wrote a book about that. But it was totally by mistake. So I'm not coming to it as someone who's a royal anorak whatsoever. I just come to it as an outsider looking at the royal family as a public institution in the same way as you look at other public institutions in receipt of public money and asking questions, are we getting value for money? And
is your general sense that this is fertile ground journalistically? Are you continuing to dig?
Oh, yes, I think it's extremely difficult to report on the royal family because you cannot, unlike other normal journalistic assignments, you cannot talk directly to them. You're getting off-the-record comments from press secretaries or whoever. So it's an extremely difficult area to report on, and many people just don't want to do it at all. The case of Johnny Diamond, who became the BBC's royal correspondent, one of their royal correspondents. He was a serious journalist based in Brussels, and he had slight misgivings about taking on this area because it's so difficult to report on.
And now, in Johnny Diamond's case?
Well, I think he's done an excellent job, is my own feeling. The upside on it is there's so much interest in it. So it's a very high profile position. So people are attracted to reporting on it because royal cell. Why are we all here? Why are we all here? Because there's enormous interest in royals, because royals sell.
Do you think it's a reasonable trade-off, this privilege that they enjoy of being able to say, I'm not going to talk to you directly, in return for the fact that they are where they are by an accident of birth? Or do you think it's in some sense absurd that we cannot talk directly to the principals in the organization that provide our head of state?
The latter, I think, is totally absurd, because they're receiving £300 million of taxpayers' money for running the royal family. So they're accountable to that. And I think what Harry has done is quite healthy in a way. If you don't want to do it, get out. I think the system up to now has been too inflexible. And clearly, Harry was unhappy with the situation. And maybe he wanted some, a hybrid royal, and he didn't get what he wanted. But clearly, he wasn't happy in doing all of this, and he should get out. And although it hasn't worked out very well, it has set a precedent. So maybe, one of William's children feels the same way. And there's a precedent for saying, listen, I want to live an independent life. So in that sense, I think Harry has opened, although it hasn't worked very well, he has opened the door for other royals to have an easy exit.
Thank you. Thomas, I'm going to keep my promise. Thank you for your patience. But let me come to Tess, who's got an exegesis on Princess Madeline, the youngest child of Sweden's king. Tess, what's it all about?
Oh, don't ask me, Giles. But I know I just put in a couple of examples of where people are trying to combine work with being a paid royal as well. But just getting to the end of this, I mean, it struck me, a couple of things just struck me, that, there is a complete identity crisis with the royal family. Is it a public institution? Is it a brand? Is it a private family? And we have to work out what it really is. And when it comes to being a public institution, then the transparency and the accountability should be the same as any other. If it's going to be a brand, then let's be clear that we're peddling a myth, an image, a brand, and we don't want to dig under the bonnet of that too much. If they want to be a private family, then you have to step out of you have to step off the stage, because you can't kind of have it all ways. And I sort of come back to this brand idea, which I think, to Tom's point about what is the value of the royal family. If you're going to be a brand ambassador for £65 billion, brand, then you've got to live, as any brand does, with a sort of authenticity and integrity. And I think one of the things that really frustrates me is the mythologizing of the royal family. The fact that there is a sort of fairy tale peddled, which bears no relation to reality, and that we have this sort of, as I called it in the chat, this sort of institutionalized deference that doesn't allow us to ask the right questions and, more importantly, get the right answers. So when it comes to, the sort of the huge interest in Harry and William, we know that there's a whole side of that story that has not been reported by the British media. We know that there are rumours of alleged infidelity on William's part that the UK press just will not touch. And frankly, if Harry has buggered off to Santa Barbara, having been on the receiving end of such extraordinary press coverage, while his brother has not received a single critical article in the UK, and, puts out 10th anniversary wedding videos that look like Bowden and Peter Jones' offspring after a drunken night out, I'm not surprised he's walked, because he's actually lifting the lid on a really skewed system of behaviour in the UK.
Thanks, Tess. Andrew Girdwood is saying that he didn't know. Fair enough.
I stuck a bigger ledge at the front of that, didn't I, Giles?
I can't remember. The Chatham House rules, love. We're okay here. We're among friends. We're approaching. There are so many things Lucy Huberman is saying that our press won't touch. So many stories, indeed. But you are in a forum where you can air them, and we will harvest them, and we will try and get them out there, Lucy. You know that. Thomas, let's come back to you. I'd just like to throw things forward. I want to ask you very briefly, the same question as I asked David. What got you into this?
Well, that's quite a long story. My mother and her family are all British, and I grew up
But you're
hearing
not.
about my. No, well, I'm British American, but I'm working on all my paperwork. But it's just always been something my great grandmother would love, and I used to take tea and still take tea with my grandmother, my mother's mother, and it's just always been part of the family. And my adopted grandfather was a grenadier since 17 years old, learning about the royal family and what it means. And I think it's very interesting what Tessa said, the mythology, because a lot of that I think is also disguised in tradition and heritage. But also, Tessa made a very good point. The royal family is all three. And they, I'm sorry, but it's indentured servitude to be a member of the royal family. For all the luxury in the gilded cage sort of talk we could have, it's not a life I think any normal person would want. And we've seen that with Prince Harry. A lot of respect to people like David, who are reporting on things that might be unsavory, but it is a little bit ridiculous that you can't get the answers you need because the palace has this iron barrier of don't explain, don't complain. Don't complain, don't explain, the other way around. And a lot of times you're just talking to people who think they're more grand than the Queen herself. So it really throws a spanner in the works when you're trying to get answers and you can't. So for all of my colleagues, Tessa, David, Alexei, really great today because we're actually able to take the lid off from what's happening here. And it's really something that we look at brands, we look at ambassadors, we look at what CEOs make, and nothing is ever said about how they live, how billionaires live, what they spend their money on. But because there is this mixture of the three components that Tessa mentioned, we have, I think, as British people, as Commonwealth realm people, even as royal watchers from America, as I originally started out as, we expect things that I think sometimes are very unfair of the royal family, especially when we don't compartmentalize the three different categories. We like to think it's one size fits all and not give actually any relevance to the other parts of what Tessa's equation was. And I think that people need to think and bear that in mind as we go forward with the possible change in head of state for the 16 countries in total. But making that point again with the Commonwealth realms and the finance question that was there, when the Queen is not living in those countries, there's the Governor General. And that department is de facto the Queen, the Governor General, and can sign legislature on behalf of the Queen. And that department does cost money. And the taxpayers of those other realms are in fact paying for that governmental department of the de facto Queen, which is the Governor General of that country.
Thomas,
So
I've got to stop you there because we're in borrowed time. And I want to give Alexei time for one closing remark. You're shaking your head, mate, but now I'm going to put you on the spot. Where do we go from here in terms of investigating, reporting on the royals? And if you don't know, then there's a sort of parallel question. Does it have any cut through, or is support for the royals in this country so strong and resistant to fact-based criticism that reporting falls on dry land?
Well, I mean, I think it's a really good question, and it's really hard to know the answer to. I do definitely think that the love and the respect that a huge number of people in this country have for the royal family means that stories about their finances and about opacity and about accountability aren't treated with the same seriousness or controversy that similar stories would be treated if they were, say written about BP or another major corporate, and that might be actually quite justified because this isn't a corporation beholden to shareholders. As Tessa said, it kind of occupies this liminal space between a brand and an institution and a private family. And I think from the more that we look at the finances behind that strange institution, the more that kind of confluence of roles is reflected in those finances themselves. So the Duchy of Cornwall, for instance, is a really good example, because, you know, on the one hand, it's exempt from corporation tax because it says that it's a crown body. On the other hand, another part of the Duchy of Cornwall says, actually, we're a private estate, and therefore we don't have to give you any many public accounts. So you can either look on that as a kind of, that's outrageous, that's you having your cake and eating it, which is a perfectly valid position, or you can say it's just a kind of natural reflection of the strange and unique role that the British monarchy has in Britain today. So I'm not sure that's really an answer to the question, but it costs the country a lot of money, and we should keep on looking into it.
It's great. We've got outrageous and natural in the same sentence. And I think I very often feel that that's exactly where we are in this country. So thank you very much, Alexei, Thomas, David, and Angela, who's left us. I think I've learned a lot about what a working royal is, how many of them Charles wants, whether he'll follow through. We'll see about that. We don't know. We found some common ground, I think, between Thomas and David, interestingly, on the absurdity of not being able to talk directly to the principals. And I think probably also some common ground based on Tess's very helpful brand, public institution, private family, that in a weird way, it is all three. And that's exactly what we're dealing with. And it's what Harry and Meghan are dealing with as they try to extricate themselves from it. I'm sorry that we couldn't get the I think it was Greg Mulligan's input next time. It's 5 past. Thank you for granting me those extra 5 minutes. It's been fascinating. Thank you to our guests once more, and to all of you for joining us. Have a great weekend, and see you again next week for more Think Teams, including another one next Friday. Bye-bye.